2 Kings chapter 14 here. We'll go ahead and read through a portion of this. Verse 1, it says, "In the second year of Joash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel, reigned Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah. And he was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jehoaddan of Jerusalem. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his father. He did according to all the things as Joash his father did, albeit the high places were not taken away. As yet the people did sacrifice and burnt incense on the high places. And it came to pass, as soon as the kingdom was confirmed in his hand, that he slew his servants which had slain the king his father. But the children of the murderers he slew not, according unto that which is written in the book of the law of Moses, wherein the Lord commanded, saying, The father shall not be put to death for the children, or the children be put to death for the fathers, but every man shall be put to death for his own sin. He slew of Edom in the valley of Salt 10,000, and he took Selah by war, and he called the name of it Joktheel until this day. And then Amaziah sent messengers to Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, king of Israel, saying, Come, let us look one another in the face. And Jehoash, the king of Israel, sent to Amaziah, king of Judah, saying, The thistle that was in Lebanon sent to the cedar that was in Lebanon, saying, Give thy daughter to my son to wife. And there passed by a wild beast that was by Lebanon, and trode down the thistle. Thou hast indeed smitten Edom, and thy heart hath lifted thee up. Glory of this, and tarry at home. For why shouldest thou meddle to thy hurt, that thou shouldest fall, even thou and Judah with thee? But Amaziah would not hear. Therefore Jehoash king of Israel went up, and he and Amaziah king of Judah looked one another in the face at Bethshemesh, which belonged to Judah. And Judah was put to the worst before Israel, and they fled every man to their tents. And Jehoash king of Israel took Amaziah king of Judah, the son of Jehoash, the son of Ahaziah, at Bethshemesh, and he came to Jerusalem. He brake down the walls of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim unto the corner gate, 400 cubits. And he took all the gold and silver and all the vessels that were found in the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house and hostages, and returned to Samaria. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoash, which he did, and his might, and how he fought with Amaziah king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jehoash slept with his fathers and was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel, and Jeroboam his son reigned in his stead. And we'll pause there. Now, chapter 13 ended with Joash being killed, and his servants. If you remember, his servants kind of rose up and slew him. Now, we're not given all the details of that, but that's how we're told he died. And so here, Amaziah, the first thing he does, his son, is to put to death those servants who killed his father. And so here we have the beginning of his lengthy reign. It was a 29-year reign. And the Bible describes this as doing that which was right in the sight of the Lord. Although it says he doesn't rise to the level of David, but obviously that was a high mark to reach. And so he does good things, as we've talked about several times. That doesn't mean he made every right choice. He did bad things, just like many of the Judah kings were told here specifically. He didn't remove the high places. People were still burning incense and doing things like that. But the general description of his rule was that it was a good rule. And he puts to death the men who killed his father. And this was the right thing to do. These men, no matter how wicked he had become, they committed murder. They conspired against the king. They murdered the Lord's anointed man to rule the nation. And they did a wicked thing. And so he follows the law. The text specifically tells us that he follows the law in doing so. He kills them, but he does not kill their children. That might sound like an odd thing to us, but it would have been kind of surprising to the people where this was written, because that would not have been the common way this was done. The common way it would have been done is to go in and wipe out everybody. You don't just take out the men, you take out the families too. And there were political reasons why they did this. You removed any kind of, grudge. If King Amaziah killed your father, it doesn't matter if your father was responsible for killing the former king, but if King Amaziah killed your father, you have potentially now created an enemy. And so, there were political reasons why they did this, but the Pentateuch, the law of Moses, told them, fathers not killed for the son's sins, sons are not killed for the father's sins. We are responsible for the things that we do. And so he goes about this the right way. And then the text just gives us just kind of a brief description of this great victory that he had over the Edomites. The Edomites had revolted from from Judah a while back. And so he has this grand victory over the Edomites. And all this was seen as kind of successes built on top of one another. And I think what happened here is he got prideful. And so he had these grand successes. And now I think he kind of thinks he's unstoppable. I can kind of do whatever, and we'll be victorious. And so now he sets his sights on Israel. And this is the beginning of his downfall here. And so he decides, I'm going to take the kingdom of Israel back. And we're not told this, but I think what should be implied here is his thought was probably well-intentioned. I think his thought was here, I will reunite the tribes. We will become one nation again, which would have been a good thing had it been, possible to do so. But nevertheless, the way he does this is he reaches out to the king of Israel and basically just tells him, let's go at it. Let's do battle. And so the text says, come, let us look one another in the face. This was not designed to be a pleasant meeting. We can understand by the context of what follows that when he says that, he doesn't want to just have a chat with the king. That's not what he's proposing. And so Jehoash, he responds with kind of a parable, and he basically says, "You're the king of Judah, and you're like this little thistle, and I'm the king of Israel, and I'm like the great cedars of Lebanon." And if you understand, we talked about this when they were building the temple, but the forestry of Lebanon was renowned. And so to say you're like a thistle and I'm like the cedars of Lebanon, basically saying there's no chance that you, the thistle, are going to conquer the cedar. It's just not going to happen. And so in his parable, he says, essentially, I don't even have to try. In the parable, a bear comes and tramples down the thistle, right? And so basically he tells them, take pride in the good things you've done. Be happy that you were victorious over the Edomites. Do that, but just let sleeping dogs lie. He says, don't meddle to your own hurt. That's what he tells them. Just, don't do it. Amaziah was a prideful man. He was right that he took pride in this. He was a prideful man. He was not going to take no for an answer, and they come together and they do battle. It says that they meet at Beth Shemesh. Beth Shemesh would have been at the northern end of the Judah border, so right over the southern edge of Israel. And the text tells us, and Judah was put to the worst before Israel, and they fled every man to their tents. And so this was a decisive victory for Israel. Now, this will come into play a little bit later. But it's interesting that God allowed Israel to have the victory here, considering that Judah, not a perfect nation by any means. Obviously, we understand that. But spiritually speaking, Judah was much, much closer in their relationship with God, much, much closer to keeping the covenant than the nation of Israel was. And yet God, and I think the implication here again is because of the prideful heart of the king, allowed Judah to be destroyed, or not destroyed, but allowed Judah to be defeated in this particular battle with Israel. Not the least of which is that God had a certain plan for Israel. God had raised up the Assyrians, and we're going to get to this very soon, but God had raised up the Assyrians. The Assyrians became the dominant people of that particular part of the world, and at that time, they were winning over everybody. They were, defeating people doesn't really say it right. Conquering people with severity, and they were doing so quite easily and quickly. And so God was raising up the Assyrians, and he chose the Assyrians to be the means of Israel's defeat. He did not choose Judah to be the means of Israel's defeat. And so, we consider and question all day why. Well, that's not for us to question. And so God allows the defeat to happen here for Judah. And what ends up happening is Jehoash and his army, they end up capturing the king Amaziah. They break down a portion of the walls of Jerusalem. They end up plundering the temple, which I think is also a sign of, God allowing and using the wicked intentions of wicked people to sometimes bring judgment against his own. Now, I know Israel is also his own. I understand that. But to plunder the temple is a sign that the nation of Israel is so far beyond caring about the covenant, caring about the things of God, caring about how things were supposed to be. Obviously, they've been steeped into the idolatry of Jeroboam for well over a century. They don't care about the temple. They don't care about how these things were supposed to take place for the people of God. But he captures the king, he plunders the temple, and they go back to Samaria with the king. And so the king actually becomes a political hostage of Israel. Now, sometime later, and we're not told exact time here, but sometime later, Jehoash dies, and after his death, Amaziah lives for another 15 years. Now, again, we're not told when, but at some point he was able to, and I think released. Again, we're having to assume some things, but my assumption is he didn't escape. But he was released from captivity in Israel, from Samaria, and he comes back to Judah. And then the text tells us some unnamed people made a conspiracy against him. And so just like his father, where he kind of started well, and then over the course of his rule kind of, went to the worst, he was conspired against. He knows this is taking place. He flees to Lachish, but is unable to outrun it, and he is there killed. Now the text tells us that he is brought back to Jerusalem, where he's given kind of a proper burial. But again, what we see is very, very reminiscent of his father, where pride really became his downfall. And then we're introduced to his son and the son of Jehoash here. And so Amaziah's son, Azariah, very similar names, but I'll try my best to say the right name. Amaziah's son, Azariah, was made king at the age of 16, and the text specifically says, instead of his father. And so this isn't the typical Amaziah dies, Azariah takes over. That he's made a king instead of his father strongly suggests to us that Amaziah was still alive, probably in captivity, and Azariah would have started what we would refer to as a co-regency. And so a co-regency is where basically the king and typically his son, sometimes maybe it's a queen, but the king and his son kind of co-rule. They would basically be considered co-kings. And in this particular case, it happened because Azariah would have naturally taken over upon Amaziah's death, but he was not yet dead. And so he begins to rule instead of his father at 16, and then would have become the sole king upon the death of Amaziah. And so Azariah is more commonly known by the name Uzziah. And so if you're familiar with the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah's kind of famous vision where he's taken up and, God says, who will I send? And he says, here am I, all this. That happened under Uzziah. And Uzziah is the name by which he's more commonly known. But that's the same man, Azariah. He had a very long and an overall successful reign. And we'll see more of that specifically in the next chapter. But it begins here. And again, he's to go back to a couple of chapters ago, this was, the line of David got shockingly slim, right? There was a chance where probably many in Judah thought it had ended. And then, God showed his faithfulness to the people, and he puts heirs of David on the throne. And whereas, again, they were not perfect men by any means, they did establish the faithfulness of God. They continued the promise to David, and they gave overall kind of general spiritual revival to the nation of Judah. Not to the degree that we'll see a little bit later on, but they were a good thing overall. They were a good thing for the nation of Judah, and we'll see that will continue with Azariah, or again, as he's more well known, Uzziah. Now in the north end, in Israel. Well, let's keep reading. We didn't read this part. So verse 17, it says, and Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, lived after the death of Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel, 15 years. And the rest of the acts of Amaziah, are they not written in the books of the chronicles of the kings of Judah? It says, now they made a conspiracy against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish, but they sent after him to Lachish, and he slew him there. And they brought him on horses, and he was buried at Jerusalem, he and his fathers, or with his fathers in the city of David. And all the people of Judah took Azariah, which was 16 years old, and made him king instead of his father Amaziah. He built Elath, and he restored it to Judah after the king slept with his fathers. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, began to reign in Samaria, and he reigned 41 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. He restored the coast of Israel from the entering in of Hamath under the sea of the plain, according to the word of the Lord of Israel, which he spake by the hand of his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, which was at Gath-hepher. It says, For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter, for there was not any shut up, nor any left, nor any helper for Israel. And the Lord said not that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam the son of Joash. Now the rest of the acts of Jeroboam and all that he did and all his might, how he warred, how he recovered Damascus and Hamath, which belonged to Judah for Israel, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jeroboam slept with his fathers, even with the kings of Israel, and Zechariah his son reigned in his stead. And so Jeroboam here, again, we get just kind of a little a snippet about him. We don't get a whole lot of information here, but Jeroboam is a very fascinating king of Israel. And that's for two reasons. First of all, he, like all the other Israelite kings, the same moniker is applied to Jeroboam that all the others had. He was an evil king. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so the general tenor of Jeroboam's reign would be described as one, spiritually speaking. Again, just as a reminder, that is what the author of Kings is more interested in than anything else. He was spiritually defined as a wicked king. But what makes it interesting is that, number one, he reigned for a long time. He reigned for 41 years. And then secondly, what makes it so fascinating is that from a worldly perspective, it was highly successful. He had one of the most successful reigns as far as the kings of Israel are concerned. And so he reigns over this really unique period of Israel's history then. And I say it's unique because we have, again, on the one hand, Israel never had, like Judah, this up and down, right? It never had spiritual revivals where they were kind of brought up out of the muck and out of the mire, and then, over time would dive down lower. It was just a straight nosedive for Israel. Every king was bad. Every king was wicked. It's not that they were devoid of prophets speaking and the word of God. It's just that they didn't care. And so Israel was steeped in idolatry, was steeped in paganism. And like I said, it was a nosedive spiritually for the nation of Israel. And then here you have Jeroboam, who is reigning well over 100 years into this time of apostasy. And so spiritually, they're not any better than they had been before. In fact, if evil and wicked kings follow evil and wicked kings, the expectation is things are just getting exponentially worse. And I do believe that's the case. And so he's not ruling at a time where anything was better spiritually speaking. Every indication is that things were worse than they were when the first Jeroboam reigned. And yet, he reigned for 41 years, and still, above all that, they had tremendous prosperity under King Jeroboam. And again, we only get signs of it here. We only get little snippets of it here. We're told in verse 25, he restored the coast of Israel from the entering in of Hamath under the sea of the plain. And then down in verse 28, the rest of the acts of Jeroboam, it says, and all that he did, how he warred, how he recovered Damascus and Hamath, which belonged to Judah. And so the little piece of Jeroboam's reign that we're shown here in 2 Kings 14 is him growing and expanding the borders of Israel, which he did. And so they in fact, what we see here is that the borders of Israel were expanded almost, not quite, but almost to the same size that it was under Solomon. And Solomon had the largest, as far as just the physical size of Israel. Solomon reigned over the largest portion of land. Now, of course, Jeroboam doesn't have Judah. I understand that. But as far as the northern portion of Israel, his borders reached almost the extent of Solomon's. And again, it's fascinating to me to think about how much worse spiritually the people were now than they were under Solomon. And yet, seemingly, there's a revival of material wealth. There's a revival of prosperity. There's not a revival spiritually speaking, but it seems like they're getting all the other kind of worldly benefits. And so a lot of people would come along and they would question this. Why is this happening? How is this taking place? Well, I'll give kind of two things on that before we close tonight. First of all, the text tells us there's an unrecorded prophecy given by Jonah. We're not told the prophecy, but the prophet Jonah, he gives this prophecy that God was going to bring this time of prosperity specifically because of God's compassion for the people of Israel. That's why this time came. It says, "For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, that it was very bitter. For there was not any shut up, nor any left, nor any helper for Israel." It's just them. They're spiritually, corrupt, but they don't have anything there bringing them up. And it says, "And the Lord said that he would not blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam." He saved them by the hand of this wicked pagan king. Right? And so again, it's such a fascinating thing that Jeroboam, of all people, again, think about not Jonah. He didn't say he was going to do it by the hand of Jonah. He didn't say he was going to do it by the hand of any of the other prophets. He said he's going to do it by the hand of Jeroboam. And so Jeroboam was able to rule over, again, this unique period, spiritual apostasy, wickedness in high places, all the things that we kind of assume about Israel, but just prosperity everywhere else. And so it's this interesting back and forth. And so on the one hand, why is this taking place? Number one, it's taking place because God was still compassionate and loved his people. Even though they were consistently rejecting him, even though they consistently turned their back upon him, what God never did was reject them or turn his back upon them. That's what he did not do. And this ought to be such a tremendous comfort to all of God's children, to all of God's people, that it doesn't matter. Now, obviously, we don't use this as an excuse, but it doesn't matter what we do. God is never going to reject his own. God is never going to reject his children. God is never going to reject his people. Now, we'll get into this actually this coming Sunday, but the scriptures specifically tell us we are the children of God. God does not reject his children. Why? He's a loving father. He's a loving father over his own. And his children mess up. His children sin. His children do things that they ought not do. But like a loving father, he corrects. Like a loving father, he guides. But also like a loving father, he doesn't just say, "That's enough," and slam the door on our face and say, "Be gone." He doesn't do that. And so here, Israel has done everything that they could do to make God do that, and yet he didn't. He was there still holding out his hand of mercy and forgiveness. And even though they didn't deserve it, and none of us do, but even though they didn't deserve it, God was still compassionate towards them. And it's easy for us to say, well, why would he do that? They didn't deserve it. Again, none of us deserve it. I don't deserve God's mercy. I don't deserve God's grace any more than these people did, and yet I'm still a recipient of it every single day. And so you have on the one side, you have the compassion of God, and then on the other hand, let me just read this quote here. This is why I find Jeroboam such an interesting character. Because on the one hand, you have 41-year reign by a man the Bible calls evil. Ultimately, that's his description. And on the other, you have that same man bringing Israel to a level of prosperity unseen in over 100 years. Now, I mentioned this a little bit, but there were historical factors that led into this. I'm not negating that. As I've already talked about, God was raising up the Assyrians. Now, one thing that happened as a result of that is that as the Assyrians got stronger, Israel's enemies got weaker. That is true. And as Israel's enemies got weaker, that was opportunity for them to get stronger until God brought Assyria to conquer them. And so there were historical factors, playing a role in on this. But again, the text is very, very clear on this, that the reason why Israel was kind of rising, at least politically, was due to God's compassion and not due to Jeroboam's competency. It wasn't just because he was the best political king that Israel ever had. It was because God was more compassionate than they ever could conceive of. That's why they were so prosperous. And this is an important concept for us to understand. So I'll close with this. To quote Davis here, prosperity may be a sign of Yahweh's compassions, but not his commendation. So Jeroboam's success was not an index of Yahweh's favor at all, only of his pity. This is a tad unnerving, for the text is saying to us, whether nations or individuals, do not mistake Yahweh's patience for his pleasure. Do not mistake his patience for his pleasure. Because there could be many people come along and say something along the lines of, well, how could God possibly be angry at me when, I have a great life? Man, I'm rich. I've got everything I ever could have wanted. And so clearly God must be pleased with me at least somewhat. Again, don't mistake God's compassion with God's pity. Don't mistake the forgiveness and the kindness and the patience of God with what's one day coming as far as the judgment of God. And so God is long suffering. The Bible is very clear about this. Israel is the clear example of this. But even in the New Testament, Peter talks about this. 2 Peter 3. God is long-suffering. Why? Because he wants people to come to him. That's why. Because he wants people to come to know him. And so God is long-suffering. And we don't need to just say, as a matter of fact, well, because that person has all these material benefits, because that person has been blessed in such a way that automatically we can assume that God is happy over this individual's life. Right? We talked about this just this past Sunday. God can and does sometimes bless us physically. God can and does sometimes bless us materially. He can do that. I believe he does do that. But that is not a sign in and of itself of God's favor over your heart spiritually. That does not mean there's not a one-to-one correlation. And so Jeroboam is the perfect example of this. Was he a good king? No, he was an evil, wicked king, and that's how the Bible describes him. And yet, in spite of all that, Israel still enjoyed a time of prosperity that they had not seen since Solomon. And so there's a lot to learn there. There's a lot for us in our nation to see there, because just like individuals, our nation has been blessed in a way that we experienced prosperity here that people could have only dreamed of 250 years ago. And yet, that doesn't necessarily mean that God is thrilled with everything our country is doing. I don't think any sane Christian would say that. And so we have to be careful to separate the one from the other, and to look at individual morality and say, does this please God? Not based upon the fact that God is bringing us prosperity. Does this please God based upon the fact does it align with his word? That's the abject judgment that we are supposed to make. Does this align with God's word? Not, does this bring riches? Does this bring, some other kind of material blessing? And so Jeroboam then becomes what I believe to be a very important lesson for all people, but Christians specifically in an age, again, of prosperity that's really unheard of throughout the history of the world. So some interesting things there. That's why I think, again, I've said already, such a fascinating king over a fascinating time in the history of Israel.